heard the call from a voice so true, down by the river where the waters move. Shadows of Emancipation, Mississippi was a land of contradictions. The United States was at war, sending young men overseas to fight for freedom, while inside its own borders, some of the oldest promises of liberty remain unfulfilled. Nearly 80 years had passed since the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet in the rural counties of Mississippi, whispers of slavery still lived on. Elders like Isaiah and Sarah, who should have been living their final years in peace, remained trapped in fields, working from sunrise to sunset without fair pay. The cotton plantations around towns such as Yazoo City, Greenwood, and Clarksdale carried echoes of tea, antebellum past for many elderly black men and women. Freedom had always been something distant, almost unreachable. Their names did not appear on government payrolls, their voices were not heard in the courthouses, and their lives were reduced to silent labor. These elders remembered the Civil War as children. Yet their twilight years mirrored the same forced toil their parents had in. Local communities often chose to ignore this reality, pretending that emancipation had erased the chains. But beneath the surface, entire groups of African Americans remained bound to the land and the will of their white employers. This was not freedom, it was the shadow of a broken promise, the legacy of the Black Codes. To understand how slavery lingered in Mississippi, we must look back at the laws that followed. Emancipation, known as the Black Codes. These restrictions emerged after the Civil War and created a system designed to keep free people tied to plantations, although they were officially outlawed. Decades earlier, their spirit continued in new forms. Labor contracts trapped workers in debt, vagrancy arrests criminalized the unemployed, and Sharif F-backed intimidation made escape almost impossible. Many elderly African Americans in Mississippi had no formal identification, no land ownership, and no way to negotiate wages. Plantation owners, often wealthy families who had ruled the counties for generations, used these conditions to maintain control. Elders like Elijah, who asked for pay, were told they already owed debts for food or shelter. Those like Beatrice who attempted to leave risked being reported as vagrants, arrested, and then sent back to the fields under threat of violence. The cotton economy demanded endless labor, and age was no protection. Men with bent backs and women with failing eyesight were still expected to pick row after row beneath the burning southern sun. These practices blurred the line between freedom and captivity, making it clear that the Black Codes had never truly died. They had only changed shape, leaving behind a cruel legacy that kept elders enslaved in everything but name. Elders in the cotton fields in Mississippi. It was common to see elderly African Americans working side by side with younger laborers in the endless cotton rows. Many, like Cornelius and Martha, were over 70 years old, their bodies frail from a lifetime of toil. Yet their labor was demanded as if they were still in their prime. In counties like Sunflower and Leffler, overseers ordered them into the fields at sunrise, forcing them to pick heavy sacks of cotton until the sun went down. Breaks were rare, and food was often nothing more than cornbread or scraps of meat, barely enough to sustain them. For these elders, the work was not a choice. They had no pensions, no savings, and no property. Most were born just after the Civil War, raised under the grip of Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws, and had spent their entire lives tied to the land of powerful white landowners. They never saw the benefits of Social Security or labor protections that others in the country began to receive. Instead, they were treated as expendable hands. The sight of elderly women with stooped backs dragging long cotton sacks through the dirt revealed a cruel truth. Slavery had not fully ended. Their calloused hands and worn-out bodies testified to decades of exploitation. Younger generations sometimes whispered that their grandparents deserved rest. But in the rigid racial order of Mississippi, the demands of the plantation outweighed any sense of humanity. Elders were forced to keep working until they collapsed, as if time itself had forgotten their freedom, living in sh. Acts, the homes where these elders lived told another part of their story, scattered near the fields or hidden behind the big houses of plantation owners. They were little more than wooden shacks. KS. Walls were made from rough planks with cracks that let in the wind and rain. Roofs leaked during storms, and dirt floors turned to mud in the wet season. Electricity was almost unheard of. ND running water was a luxury reserved for the main house. Inside these shacks, families slept on straw mattresses or piles of old rags. A fireplace or small stove was the only source of heat, and the smoke often filled the rooms, stinging the eyes and lungs. Food was cooked in iron pots, but there was rarely enough. Gardens provided a few vegetables, and sometimes chickens or hogs were kept. Most supplies came from the plantation store, where everything was overpriced and added to the workers' debt. Elders who had spent decades laboring lived their last years in these same shacks, and, ever escaping the cycle of poverty, they told stories of having seen the promise of freedom in their youth. Yet their old age was spent in conditions nearly identical to slavery times. Visitors from outside Mississippi were often shocked by these living arrangements, but for local communities, it was considered normal. The shacks symbolized more than poverty. They were a silent reminder that the freedom promised after the Civil War had not truly reached every corner of America. For elders still trapped in this system, the walls of wood and dirt were their final prison, holding them captive long after the chains were supposed to be broken. The fear of speaking out. In Mississippi, silence was not only a habit but a survival strategy. Elderly African Americans who still lived and worked under conditions that mirrored slavery understood the price of speaking out. To question their treatment meant risking beatings, eviction from their shacks, or even death at the hands of local enforcers. Many had lived through lynchings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and those memories served as constant reminders of what could happen if they dared to resist. Plantation owners and overseers often ruled through fear rather than law. A single elder asking for fair pay could be labeled as troublesome and punished by being denied food rations or forced into heavier work. Some who tried to leave were hunted down by local sheriffs, brought back, and humiliated in front of others as an example. Gossip spread quickly. In small towns like Indianola or Belzoni, where elders whispered warnings to each other, do not speak too loud. Do not let them hear you. This climate of fear silenced testimonies for decades. Many elders carried their suffering quietly, believing that their voices would never be heard. Even church gatherings, one of the few safe spaces, had to be careful because informants sometimes reported sermons that spoke directly about freedom. The fear was not only physical but psychological. After a lifetime of threats, many elders believed that speaking up was hopeless. The accepted silence as the only shield they had left. This silence is why so many stories of hidden slavery remain buried for years, locked inside the memories of people too afraid to tell the truth, until their final days. World War II and the irony of freedom. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next all stories about slavery. Let's continue. Mississippi existed within a larger national contradiction. Across the ocean, American soldiers were fighting against Nazi tyranny, carrying the banner of freedom and democracy. Posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts celebrated liberty as the great cause of the war. Yet in the cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta, elderly African Americans still denied that very same freedom. While the federal government demanded sacrifices from all citizens, these elders were excluded from programs that could have offered relief. The Social Security Act largely left out agricultural and domestic workers, jobs that most black elders in Mississippi held. This meant they received no pensions, no unemployment insurance, and no protections as they aged. As young white men went off to war, the burden of agricultural production fell heavier on the backs of elderly black laborers who continued to toil as if emancipation had never come. The irony was bitter. Newspapers in towns like Jackson or Vicksburg printed patriotic slogans, while just miles away, elders in their 70s and 80s bent over cotton plants under the threat of viol. Hence, America was exporting the idea of liberty to Europe and Asia, yet ignoring the chains that still bound people at home. This contradiction was not lost on the elders themselves. Some, like Acon Jones, quietly prayed that victory overseas might someday bring justice to their lives. Others felt the weight of despair, realizing that decades had passed and little had changed. World War II, remembered as the fight for human dignity, only deepened the painful contrast. The United States could wage war for freedom abroad, but in Mississippi, freedom remained a promise unfulfilled. Secret records and hidden testimonies. Whispers of hidden slavery in Mississippi began to reach the ears of a few brave individuals. Local church leaders, school teachers, and traveling pre-acres often served as the first to hear the quiet confessions of elderly men and women who revealed they were still being held in near slavery. In small towns such as Greenville or Clarksdale, ministers wrote down names, dates, and descriptions in notebooks that were kept hidden, fearing retaliation if the records were discovered. Some activists connected to small black newspapers risked their safety by documenting these testimonies. They visited elders in shacks or cotton fields, listening carefully as the old voices spoke of endless labor, withheld wages, and punishment. Hence, for disobedience, many of the stories were told in hushed tones, with elders looking over their shoulders as they spoke, terrified that someone might overhear. The testimonies often described debt, ales too specific to be ignored, overseers' names, the number of hours worked each day, or how rations of food were controlled to keep them dependent. Some elders confessed they had not seen money in decades, their entire survival tied to the will of the landowner. These hidden records were fragile lifelines to the truth, evidence that slavery's shadow had not disappeared, but only changed form. Although these accounts rarely reached the wider press during the war years, they remained preserved in private diaries, church archives, and community letters. They represented the courage of a people who, even in silence and fear, found ways to leave behind proof of their suffering. Without these secret testimonies, the last stories of slavery in Mississippi might have vanished completely. The federal government's blind. Even as whispers of continued slavery reached activists and church leaders, the federal government and local authorities often turned a blind eye. In Mississippi, sheriffs, judges, and county officials were deeply tied to the plantation economy. Many had financial or family connections to landowners, and they saw no benefit in alleging the system that kept black laborers under control. Reports of mistreatment were frequently dismissed, labeled as exaggerations or local disputes. Federal agencies, stretched thin by the hands of World War II, rarely intervened in rural labor disputes. When inspectors or officials did visit, they were often shown only the acceptable side of plantation life, the front porches of landowners' homes or neatly prepared fields, while the shacks of the workers were hidden from sight. The few complaints that reached Washington were buried under bureaucracy with no urgency to address the reality that elderly people were still enslaved in practice. For the elders themselves, appealing to the law was unthinkable. Sheriffs who were supposed to protect them often acted as enforcers for landowners, ensuring that runaways were caught and returned. Courts offered no justice, and the threat of jail for vagrancy was a constant weapon used to keep them silent. This official illness was not accidental, it was deliberate. By ignoring the truth, authorities preserved the illusion that emancipation had been fulfilled. It allowed Mississippi to appear modern while keeping its oldest and weakest citizens trapped in bondage. The failure of the federal government to confront this reality ensured that the last records of slavery remained hidden for far too long. The last recorded cases A few final testimonies emerged that revealed elderly African Americans in Mississippi were still being treated as slaves. These were not vague rumors, but concrete cases, oft, and involving men and women in their 70s or 80s, whose entire lives had been consumed by forced labor. On plantations near towns like Yazoo City and Greenwood, elders spoke of being ordered into the fields at dawn, carrying sacks of cotton that weighed almost as much as their frail bodies. They received no wages and were told their food and shelter were payment enough. One account described an 80-year-old woman named Hattie, her hair silver and her back bent, who was forced to cook for a plantation household while also tending to chickens and gardens. She was never all owed to leave the property. Another case involved a 75-year-old man named Silas who had picked cotton since he was a boy. When asked why he never left, he replied quietly, "Where would I go? The sheriff would bring me back." These cases represented the cruel endurance of slavery long after it was declared illegal. They were not isolated, but they were rarely written down in official records. Instead, they survived in the memories of family members, church registers, and private letters. These elders were among the last living witnesses to a system that had never fully let them go. Their stories mark the closing chapter of a dark era, proof that slavery's shadow reached further into the 20th century than most Americans ever admitted. Remembering the forgotten as the war years passed, many of the elders who had lived in hidden bondage in Mississippi quietly faded away. Their stories, often told in whispers or left behind in church notes, became fragments of a history that the nation preferred not to face. Yet their lives carried a powerful message. They had endured nearly 8 decades after emancipation only to find themselves still bound by the same LDS, the same shacks, and the same fear. To remember them is to confront the truth that freedom in America was uneven, delayed, and often denied. These elders symbolize the resilience of a people who survived despite impossible conditions, but they also represent the nation's failure to honor its own promise. Towns like Clarksdale, Bolzoni, and Indianola held these untold stories within their soil. Cotton Rows bore witness to their unending labor. Wooden cabins echoed with their prayers. Today, their memory is more than a historical footnote. It is a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied, and that the elders of Mississippi may have been among the last recorded cases of slavery in America, but their voices still call to us across time. They remind us that freedom is not only declared, it must be lived, defended, and remembered. Their forgotten lives are now a part of the nation's story, one that demands to be told with honesty and respect.